Greetings, viewers around the world. In the wake of the 2016 election in the United States, a lot of questions have arisen about polling data, why the polls were so wrong, and also the issue of non-voting. Did people simply not voting cause Donald Trump to be elected over Hillary Clinton? Well, first, let's talk a little bit about polling. In order to get accurate poll results, you have to do your sampling with something called a representative sample of the population, and it would appear, or the voting population anyway, and it would appear that the Los Angeles Times poll and the Investors Business Daily poll did a substantially better job in getting representative samples. If you want accurate results, you have to get a representative sample. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, say you have a town that is, and I'm going to use round numbers and fairly low numbers for the sake of simplicity here, but say you have a town where the population is 30% Hispanic, 30% African American, and 40% white. And for the sake of this discussion, we're combining race and ethnicity, and we're going to say that the three categories you have in that town are Hispanics, whites, and African Americans. Well, if you had those numbers, and those numbers equal 100%, and you wanted to come up with a representative sample of that town, 100 people to be a representative sample, then you would need in that 100 people to have 30 African Americans, 30 Hispanics, and 40 whites. And if you had that, then you would have a representative sample of the community, but only in one aspect of the community, in race and ethnicity. You see, those three groups would also have to be broken down by marital status. You want to know who was married, divorced, widowed, and never married, and you would want to know the percentage of each of those groups to break that down. And then you would need to know how they break down by religion. Within the Hispanic community, what kinds of, what brands of religion do you have, and how many people in that community belong to each. Then you would need to know about educational level. You would need to know whether people are college graduates or high school graduates, or they had some college, or they were high school dropouts. And you would have to break that down for each of the three categories. Then you would need to know about occupation, and you would have to break down the three categories based on the types of occupation that people had. And there are seemingly endless numbers of ways that you could break down the population to get a representative population. And the more of the different kind of ways that you break this down, the more likely you are to get a representative sample of the population. So as you can see, it's very tedious, detailed work. Very tedious, very detailed. There's a lot involved in getting a representative sample. And in breaking down all of the various categories and seeing how the categories interrelate to each other, there are plenty of opportunities to make colossal mistakes. You have to be very exacting and very detailed to get this right. Now, the question arises, can pollsters manipulate data to turn out a certain way? Indeed they can, because when a news organization or some other organization contracts with an organization to conduct a poll, it's very unlikely that you have somebody looking over the shoulder of the head bean counter. And in the case of the U.S. election, I think polling organizations were well aware that a lot of the people who were paying for these polls were looking for certain types of results. And they were also aware of the tremendous opposition to the Trump presidency, and possibly worried about the reactions if polls showed Donald Trump leading. Because pollsters, people who do this research and gather the data and interpret the data, they're only human beings too. And in the case of the U.S. election, you saw this massive amount of bias in the media the news media was openly biased. They made no bones about who they thought should be elected president of the United States. And you saw this especially with CNN in the opening days of the election, because the CNN reporters were just plain mad. And so it was pretty obvious that they did not really make an effort to be objective, that a lot of reporters in this case thought it was okay to suspend their objectivity and openly advocate for a certain candidate. You had in this year an awful lot of Trump shaming, that, if people stated they were going to vote for Trump, then everybody would turn on them. And so a lot of people, more than likely, did not give obvious answers because people were so condemning in their attitudes of Trump supporters. So that probably happened. But what more likely happened is, as I tried to explain in the beginning, they did not get a good representative sample. They just didn't do a very good job as far as breaking down the population and dividing the segments of the population in all these different categories: marital status, age, race, religion, occupation, educational level, and all of those things. It takes an incredible amount of work to do that. And then, as I said, people don't look over the shoulders of the bean counters very much. So data, I know this much from my studies in college level statistics, is that data can be manipulated and it can be interpreted to say what people want it to say. And that does in fact happen. And this year there were a tremendous number of people in various institutions, in the press and in academia and Hollywood, and a lot of institutions who wanted this to go a certain way. So I think there probably was some bias in the polling data, and that's why the data ended up not being so accurate, except for Investor Business Daily and the Los Angeles Times poll. But sure, data can be manipulated. It absolutely can be manipulated, and it can be interpreted the way people want to interpret it, because there are so many people who are just not aware of what goes on in the processes of data collection. I've described a little bit of it, but it's very detailed and tedious work. Now, I think if an organization really wanted to commit to getting an accurate representative sample, they could have done that. But I think that the commitment to do so may have been lacking somewhat in this election year, because it's been a very unusual year. And I think the same thing happened with the Brexit vote, that possibly the polling organizations in Great Britain did not get good representative samples. And there was also this issue of the shaming of people who wanted to leave the European Union because opposition was so huge. So I think there were issues with the way that the polls were constructed and the way that they were conducted. Now, there's this other issue that approximately, well, I'm not going to say the number because I'm not sure the number, but a huge number of Americans did not vote in this election. And some questions have been raised as to whether that caused Donald Trump to beat Hillary Clinton. Well, it's like this. I don't think so. I think that what you had with the people who voted was actually a very good representative sample of the population. And here's why I say that. On election night, and I was watching various channels because I wanted to get different perspectives. I would say on that night I watched ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox, BBC, and PBS at least, because I wanted as many perspectives as possible. And the thing that I heard over and over again during the coverage of the election was that huge numbers of Hispanics were voting in Florida, huge numbers of Latinos, and for that reason Hillary Clinton was expected to carry Florida. And yet they were also amazed at the very same time they were talking about the huge numbers of the Latino vote. They were also puzzled because it wasn't helping, because Trump was consistently leading in Florida throughout the night. So what happened there? Well, you may have seen a huge increase in the Latino vote, but there was also a huge increase in other people voting as well. rural white voters also came out in huge numbers, and those numbers apparently overcame the Latino vote. You see, it doesn't matter if a minority population, if that vote rises exponentially, if the majority vote rises exponentially as well, then the majority is still going to have their way. And I suspected this was happening when I looked at the results coming in from some of the red states where Mr. Trump's margin of victory over Mrs. Clinton was just huge. Well, even before the states were called, the margins of his leads were huge, and then the margins of final victory were also huge. And I remember thinking at the time that with these ridiculously large margins, it's reasonable to assume that the white working class vote, for example, is also surging in blue states. And indeed it did. And I also heard reports from different parts of the country that day, telephone, email, and some other things, what was happening in rural, mostly white areas, such as Alabama and Wyoming and Idaho and some places like that. And the stories I was hearing was of huge numbers of voters lined up in these Republican areas, just unbelievably long lines in some places. And I got to thinking, you know, that kind of suggests something to me that might be going on. Now, it's true that minorities are becoming a larger part of the U.S. population, but for now and for some time to come, white voters are still a very huge majority. I think it's in the 70% range or 70-something percent or something like that. So if they vote for a certain candidate in large numbers, they still have the ability to carry the day. And I think that is part of what happened. So do I believe that if everybody in the United States had voted, that the result would have been different? No, I don't necessarily think so. Because I think that if a lot more African Americans voted and a lot more Latinos had voted, and then at the same time a lot more white voters would have voted, because that seems to have been what happened in Florida and in some other areas. So I think what you got on election night was more or less a representative sample of the entire population as it was on that day. So that's my analysis. This business of representative samples and things like that and extrapolating data, it's very complicated. It's very complicated and it's very detailed. So I don't know if anything that I've said is actually going to make a lot of sense or not. But it does to me, so that's sort of the way I see it. I think that polling organizations did not get good representative samples, and I don't particularly think that non-voting was an issue in the turnout. Because if one group votes in large numbers, well then, the larger group can vote in large numbers too. And that seems to have been what happened in Florida, as I understand it. And so that's my perspective on polling and non-voting in the 2016 election. Thanks and have a good day.